I have buried 12 men in this valley. I dug every one of those graves myself, because a man ought to know the weight of what he puts in the ground. But there's one grave I never had to dig, and it's the one that still wakes me up at 3 in the morning, 40 years later, reaching for a rifle that isn't there. This isn't a story about the 12. This is about the 13th man who should have died, and the boy who rode 11 hours through a blizzard that killed 3 grown men that same night, to make sure he didn't. I was there. I watched the whole town stand on their porches and call it a mercy, letting the snow do what they didn't have the stomach to do themselves. I want to tell you I was better than them. I wasn't. I just hesitated a little longer before I turned my back. This is what happened when a father lay dying in my barn, and a son who had every reason in the world to let him die out there anyway, chose instead to ride into the one storm that had already taken his mother 7 winters before. If you've ever had to choose between what's easy and what's right, and you know which one you actually chose, this story is going to sit with you a while. The snow had a smell to it that night, sharp and metallic, like the inside of a rifle barrel, and I've never been able to explain that to a man who hasn't lived through a territory winter. You smell it before it hits, a kind of held breath in the air, and every animal on my property, every last chicken and mule and dog, went dead quiet about an hour before the sky opened up. I was out checking the north fence line, which in hindsight was a fool errand, but I keep a ledger. Not for money, well, for money too, but for everything. Debts owed to me, debts I owe, kindnesses given, kindnesses received, wrongs done and wrongs suffered, tallied in 3 columns like a man keeping score in a game only he's playing. My wife used to say I'd tally my own funeral if I could find a way to collect on it after. That fence had been on my ledger for 6 days under owed unfinished, and I could not abide an unfinished column, storm or no storm. That's the only reason I was out there to see him. He was maybe 200 yards off on the ridge above Miller's Creek, and at first I took him for a fence post, because a man doesn't expect another man to be standing upright in that kind of wind unless something's gone badly wrong with him. Then he went down. Not fell, folded, like his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him. I want to be honest with you about what went through my head in that moment, because I've spent 40 years wanting to lie about it and I'm too old now to keep doing it. My first thought was not there's a man dying out there. My first thought was, that's an Apache, out past the treaty line, and if I ride out there and something happens to me, nobody in Ash Hollow is going to come looking past dark. I stood there long enough for the wind to cut through my coat like it wasn't there. Long enough that I could have turned around, finished my count of the fence posts, and gone home to a fire and pretended I hadn't seen a thing. Snow has a way of covering up whatever you decide not to look at. That's its cruelest mercy. I rode out anyway, not because I was good, because that unfinished column in my ledger had trained something into me over the years, an inability to leave a thing as I found it broken. He was heavier than he looked, which men in that condition always are, dead weight fighting you even when they've got no fight left in them. His right leg was bent wrong below the knee, and there was blood freezing black in the snow beneath it, and when I got him turned over I saw his eyes were open and tracking me, which surprised me more than anything else that night. A man that far gone, you don't expect him watching you decide whether to save him. "Rope," he said, just the one word through a jaw so tight with cold it barely moved. He nodded toward his boot, where a coil of rawhide rope had come loose from his saddle pack, his horse nowhere in sight, bolted or dead. I never found out which. I understood him then. He wasn't asking me to save his life. He was asking me not to let his gear scatter into the storm, because gear was survival, and survival was a habit stronger in him than fear. I got that rope. I don't know why that mattered to me so much in the moment, but it did. It was the first true thing I learned about him, that even dying, he was still thinking 3 steps ahead, still protecting what little he had left to protect. I've known cattlemen twice his size who lost their composure over a busted wagon wheel. This man was bleeding out in a blizzard, and his mind was on his rope. Getting him onto my horse took every curse word I owned, and a few I invented for the occasion. He was no help to me. Couldn't be. That leg wasn't going to bear weight for weeks even if it healed clean, which it didn't look like it was going to. I got him slung belly down over the saddle like a deer carcass, which shamed me even as I did it, because no man deserves to be carried like meat, but the storm doesn't negotiate on dignity. It just asks whether you're going to live through the next hour. The ride back to my place was the longest 3 miles of my life, and I have ridden through range fires and a stampede that took 4 of my father's ribs. The wind came sideways, and twice I lost the trail entirely and had to trust the horse's instinct over my own eyes, which is a hard thing for a stubborn man to do. My hands went numb around the reins somewhere in that second mile, and I remember thinking, with a strange, drifting calm that I now recognize as the first stage of freezing to death myself, that if we both died out there, at least neither of us would die alone. That thought should have scared me more than it did. We made it. I got him into the barn because I will tell you plainly, I did not have the nerve that first night to bring him into my own house. That's a shame I've carried since, sharper some years than others. I told myself it was because the barn had the stove for the tack room, which was true. But it wasn't the whole truth, and a ledger man knows better than most that half a truth is just a lie with better posture. I packed his leg the best I knew how. I'd set enough bones on my own cattle to have a rough notion, and I gave him whiskey, which he refused with a small shake of his head, and water, which he took in slow, deliberate swallows like a man rationing something precious even when there was a whole well of it 20 feet away. Old habits, I understood later, from a life where nothing had ever been guaranteed to refill. By morning, word had gotten to town. I don't know how. Maybe Delbert Cray saw my tracks going out toward the ridge. Maybe someone spotted the extra horse missing from the corral. Ash Hollow was the kind of town where a secret had a shorter life expectancy than a June frost. By noon, 3 men were standing in my yard, and the one doing the talking was Ezra Pollard, who ran the feed store and considered himself, by virtue of owning the only working printing press in 3 counties, something like a mayor nobody had elected. "Heard you took in an Indian," Ezra said. "Not a question. A charge already halfway to a verdict." "Took in a man with a broke leg," I said. "Didn't ask him his politics before I did it." That got a laugh out of nobody. Ezra's mouth went thin the way it did before he said something he'd already decided was righteous. "You know what they did to the Hallorans boy 2 winters back?" I did know. Everybody knew. It had happened 40 miles from here. Wasn't even the same band of people. Wasn't even the same tribe if you wanted to split that hair, which nobody in Ash Hollow ever cared to. Grief doesn't stay in its lane. It spreads out and blames whoever's nearest and looks most like the thing that hurt it. "This man didn't do that," I said. "This man's got a broke leg and near froze to death on my land." "Your land," Ezra repeated, like the words themselves were an argument. "Then it's your business what happens on it. But don't come asking the church for bandages, and don't come asking Doc Ferris to ride out here, because I promise you he won't, and neither will anybody else with sense." They left after that. Didn't threaten, exactly. Ezra Pollard was never a man to threaten outright. He preferred the kind of cruelty you could deny having intended. But before he turned his horse, he looked toward my barn and said the words that have stayed lodged in my chest for 40 years like a splinter too deep to dig out clean. Let the snow bury him. It was already trying to. I stood in my own yard and said nothing back. That's the part I can't forgive myself for, even now. Not that they said it. That I let it stand there in the cold air between us, unanswered, like maybe I agreed with a piece of it. I went back into the barn. The man was awake, propped against a hay bale, and I understood by the stillness in his face that he'd heard every word through the thin plank walls. There was no anger in his expression. That was almost worse than anger would have been. It was the look of a man who had heard that sentence, in one form or another, his whole life, and had simply run out of the energy required to be surprised by it any more. "They're not wrong to be afraid," he said finally. His voice was rough, but steadier than it had been the night before. "Fear makes cruel men out of ordinary ones. I have seen it happen on both sides of every line that's ever been drawn out here." "That doesn't make it right," I said. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't make it right. It only makes it common." I asked him his name then, which shames me that I hadn't asked sooner. I'd been so occupied with the mechanics of keeping him alive that I'd nearly forgotten to treat him like a man with a name rather than a problem to be solved. "Etzo," he said. I told him mine. He nodded like he was filing it away in some ledger of his own, and I found myself wondering, for the first time in my life, whether a man like Etza kept his own tally of kindnesses and wrongs, whether somewhere in his memory there was a column with my name freshly entered, still undecided which side it would end up on. He told me, in pieces over that first long day, why he'd been out on that ridge alone in weather that any sane man would have sheltered from 3 days before it turned. He was tracking, he said, toward a trading post 2 valleys over, hoping to reach it before the worst of the season closed the pass. Supplies were thin in his camp that winter, thinner than usual, after a summer that hadn't been kind to anyone's crops or cattle regardless of what nation they called home. He'd misjudged the storm. Said it plainly, without excuse or self-pity, the way a man speaks when he's long past needing to protect his own pride from the facts. "I have a son," he said later that night, when the fever from his leg had started climbing and his words had begun to loosen at the edges the way a sick man's will. "He does not know where I am. He will look for me when I do not come home by the day I promised." "How far's your camp?" "Far enough," Etza said, "that if he comes looking in this weather, he will be doing something foolish enough that his mother, if she were still living, would have taken a switch to him for even considering it." I asked carefully what had happened to his wife. He looked at me for a long moment before he answered, and something passed behind his eyes that I recognized even then, though I couldn't have named it. The particular exhaustion of a grief that's been asked to explain itself too many times to strangers who wanted the story more than they wanted to sit with the man who'd lived it. "A winter like this one," he said, 7 years past. I promised my son I would not let another one take me the same way. I didn't sleep much that night, I won't lie and say I did. I lay in my own bed listening to the wind try to peel the roof off my house, thinking about a boy somewhere out past the treaty line who didn't yet know his father had broken a promise he hadn't meant to break, and about a town full of my neighbors who had already decided, before they'd met him, exactly what that man's life was worth. By the 3rd morning, Etza's fever had climbed high enough that I stopped believing my rough doctoring was going to be enough. The leg had gone a color I didn't like, and there's a particular sweetrot smell that comes before infection turns a wound into a death sentence, and I recognized it because I'd smelled it on cattle before I'd ever smelled it on a man. I rode into Ash Hollow that afternoon, against every piece of good sense I owned, to ask Doc Ferris one more time. He said no before I'd finished the sentence, said it kindly, almost apologetically, which somehow made it worse than if he'd shouted it. "I've got a practice to keep, Silas. Folks around here wouldn't take kindly to me treating an Indian in my own office, and I can't say I blame them enough to risk my family's bread over it." I rode home with nothing but a bottle of carbolic acid I'd bought off the shelf myself, no doctor's hand behind it, and a growing, sick certainty that I was watching a man die by 1,000 small refusals. None of them a knife, none of them a bullet, just an entire town quietly agreeing to look the other way and calling it none of their affair. That night, sitting beside him in the lamplight while he drifted in and out of a fever-thick sleep, I opened my ledger and wrote something in it I'd never written before. Not a debt, not a kindness owed or received. Just a question in my own cramped hand, that I didn't yet have an answer to. What is a man's life worth, when everyone around him has already decided it's worth nothing? I didn't know that night that somewhere 2 valleys east, a young man named for his grandfather was already saddling a horse into weather that had killed better riders than him, because his father hadn't come home when he promised. And some promises, once broken, a son decides to keep for you. I need to tell you about the storm before I tell you about the boy, because you won't understand what he rode into unless I make you feel it the way I felt it, standing in my own doorway on the 4th night, watching the sky do something I'd only seen twice before in 30 years on that land. The old-timers called it a widowmaker storm, and not for poetry's sake. It was the kind that dropped the temperature 40 degrees in under 3 hours, that turned a clear afternoon into a wall of white so total you could lose your own hand in front of your face. I'd seen men die 8 feet from their own front porch in weather like that, close enough to hear their family calling for them, too disoriented by the whiteout to find the sound. Etsa's fever had broken that morning, which should have been good news, but it left him weak in a way that frightened me more than the fever had. He was lucid, at least, lucid enough to understand what I told him when I came back in from checking the animals and said the sky looked like it was fixing to do something ugly. "My son will come," he said, "not a hope, a fact stated the way you'd state the weather itself." "In this," I said, "nobody in their right mind rides in this." Etsa looked at me with an expression I've turned over in my memory 1,000 times since, trying to find the right word for it. Not pride exactly. Not fear either, though there was fear in it somewhere, buried under something steadier. "He is not in his right mind," Etsa said quietly. "He is in his father's mind. There is a difference." I didn't understand him then. I do now. The boy's name, I would learn, was Nashoba, though I'd get the pronunciation wrong for the first week, and he'd correct me each time with more patience than I deserved, never once making me feel small for the failing, which is its own kind of grace I didn't appreciate near enough at the time. He was 19, maybe 20, old enough to have already buried a mother and watched his father grow old faster than a man should, young enough that he still believed, somewhere underneath the calluses life had already given him, that if he just moved fast enough, wanted it hard enough, he could outride grief itself. He set out from his camp at first light on the 4th day, when his father was 3 days overdue, and the sky to the west had already begun its slow curdle toward violence. I know this because he told me himself, later in that flat, unadorned way some men have of recounting the worst hours of their lives, no embellishment, because the truth needed none. He told his uncle he was going to check the low pass, a lie small enough to be believed, because the truth, that he meant to ride the whole distance toward Ash Hollow territory, into land where his people were not welcome and might well be shot at on sight, was not a truth anyone in his camp would have let him act on. His uncle would have tied him to a post before he'd have let him ride toward a white settlement alone in that weather, and Nashoba knew it. And so he left before anyone could stop him from doing the thing he'd already decided was the only thing worth doing. He carried little. A knife his father had given him the year his voice changed. A hide bag with strips of dried meat that wouldn't last more than a day if the ride ran long, which it would. And a compass his father had traded 3 good pelts for from a wandering trapper years before. Not because Etsa trusted white instruments over his own reading of the land, Nashoba told me later, almost laughing at the memory even through everything that came after, but because Etsa had wanted his son to have every possible tool, every possible advantage, in case the day ever came when the old ways of finding your path weren't enough. His father had given him a compass built for exactly this kind of day, without either of them knowing it at the time. The first 4 hours were manageable. Hard riding, cold enough to numb his face beneath the wrapped cloth, but manageable, the kind of cold a body could still fight against. It was somewhere past the halfway point, he said, that the sky changed color in a way he'd never seen before, going from gray to a strange yellow-white, and the wind that had been at his back turned to meet him head-on, like the storm itself had noticed him and decided to argue. I want to tell you what that ride was like, but I've never lived it myself, only heard it told, and told again in the years after, each time a little more worn smooth at the edges the way memory does to the things that hurt too much to keep sharp. What I can tell you is what the storm did to grown men on the same night, men twice his age, men who'd grown up on that land because 3 of them died in it. Delbert Cray's cousin, riding home from a card game, found stiff against a fence post the next morning less than a mile from his own front door. A trapper whose name I never learned, found weeks later when the melt finally came. And a soldier riding dispatch between forts, whose horse made it back alone, saddle empty, and nobody ever recovered him at all. The land simply kept him. That was the storm a 19-year-old boy rode into, alone, on a promise made to a father who might already have been dead by the time he set out. He told me later that somewhere in the 5th or 6th hour, he stopped being able to feel his own hands on the reins, and that was the moment real fear finally caught up with the resolve that had carried him that far. Not fear of dying, he said. He'd made his peace with that possibility before he ever left camp, the way a man does when he's decided a thing is worth the risk of everything. It was a different fear. The fear that he might die before he reached his father, and that his father, if he was even still alive, would die alone in the barn of a stranger, believing his son hadn't come. That thought, he told me, was the thing that kept him upright when his body had every reason to fold. Not courage in the way we like to romanticize it in stories, not some clean, burning determination, something smaller and more stubborn than that. The simple, ugly refusal to let his father's last belief in this world be a wrong one. He lost the trail twice. Both times he found it again not by sight, which the storm had stolen from him entirely, but by a kind of memory in his horse's body, and by his own hands finding, half by instinct, the shape of landmarks buried under snow he could no longer see. A split boulder his father had once pointed out to him as a boy, a dead cottonwood struck by lightning 3 summers back that he found only by running his numb fingers along its blackened bark. The compass, he said, he checked constantly, though half the time his eyes were so crusted with ice, and his hands shaking so badly he could barely read it. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it was his father's gift, in his pocket, and some part of him needed to believe that carrying it meant carrying some piece of his father's protection along with it. He passed within a half-mile of Ash Hollow proper sometime after midnight, though he didn't know it at the time, didn't know how close he'd come to riding straight into the heart of a town that would have met him, at that hour, in that condition, as a threat before they ever saw him as a son looking for his father. It was a stroke of blind luck, or something less easily explained, that turned his horse's instinct toward the outlying properties instead, toward the scattered ranches on the edge of town where I kept my land. Because it was there, sometime in the black hour before dawn, that Nashoba finally saw a single light burning in a window through the thinning edge of the storm, and rode toward it because it was the only thing in the entire white world that looked like it might still be alive. That light was mine. I'd left the lamp burning in the barn, tending Etza through what I feared, by that point, might be his last night. His fever had returned that evening, worse than before, and I'd resigned myself to the grim work of sitting with a dying man because nobody else in 3 counties would. I heard the horse before I heard the boy. A sound I'll never forget, not hooves at a gallop, which is what you'd expect, but something slower, more ragged, the sound of an animal being asked to give the very last of itself and somehow finding a way to comply. I opened the barn door with my rifle half raised, because a man doesn't know what's riding out of a blizzard at that hour, and what I found instead was a boy so caked in ice he looked carved from it, sliding off his horse before it had fully stopped, his legs buckling the moment they took his weight, catching himself on the doorframe with hands that had gone the wrong color entirely. My father, he said, just that, 2 words forced out through a jaw that could barely move and a voice cracked down to nothing. "Etsa. Is he?" I didn't answer him with words. I stepped aside and let him see. I have watched a great many things in my life that I'd call unforgettable, but I have never seen anything like the sight of that boy crossing the last 10 feet of that barn floor. Not walking. Not really. More like something between a walk and a collapse held together by sheer refusal. To reach a father who, at that exact moment, opened fever-glazed eyes, and recognizing the shape moving toward him even through the haze of his own sickness, said one word that I didn't understand then and have never forgotten since. His son's name. I stepped back out into the cold, because there are moments a man has no business witnessing up close, no matter how much of the story came through his own barn door. I stood in that yard in the last dying breath of the storm, snow still falling but softer now, almost gentle, like even the weather understood something had just been decided that it no longer needed to fight against. I thought about Ezra Pollard's words from 4 days before, "Let the snow bury him." The snow had tried. It had thrown everything it had at that boy for 11 straight hours, had taken 3 grown men that same night as if to prove it meant business, and it had failed against one 19-year-old with a dead man's compass in his pocket and a promise he refused to let be broken. I stood there a long while before I went back inside, because I needed a minute to decide what kind of man I was going to be about what came next, because I understood, standing in that yard, that the hardest part of this story hadn't happened yet. Etsa was alive, but barely. The infection in his leg hadn't waited for his son's arrival to keep spreading. And somewhere back in Ash Hollow, word of a wild Indian, riding through the blizzard toward my property, was very likely already spreading faster than the thaw. I went back inside. Nashoba was kneeling beside his father's bedroll, one of Etsa's hands wrapped in both of his own frostbitten ones, and neither of them was speaking. They didn't need to be. I understood, watching them, that I was looking at something I had no language for, the particular silence of 2 people who had each, separately, spent the last several days believing they might be about to lose the other, and had been wrong. I closed the barn door softly behind me and went to put more wood on the stove, because whatever came next, I'd already decided one thing standing out in that yard. I was done letting other men's cruelty decide what happened under my own roof. What I didn't yet know was that decision was about to cost me more than I'd bargained for. Nashoba's hands were the worst of it. Frostbite had taken the ends of 2 fingers on his right hand, not the whole hand, thank God, but enough that I watched something pass across his face the first time he understood it, a flicker of grief so quick and so quickly buried that I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching for exactly that. He never once complained. Not that first week, not in all the weeks after. If anything, the loss seemed to sharpen something in him rather than dull it, the way certain kinds of pain do to certain kinds of people. Etsa's leg was worse. Whatever mercy the fever breaking had seemed to promise, the infection hadn't honored it. By the second morning after Nashoba's arrival, the wound had gone past anything my carbolic acid and rough doctoring could manage, and I understood, with the particular sick clarity of a man watching something slip past the point of his own competence, that Etsa was going to lose that leg or lose his life, and there wasn't a version of the next week where I could make that choice easier for anyone. I rode into Ash Hollow one more time. I want to tell you I did it boldly, chin up, righteous. I didn't. I did it scared and angry at being scared, which is its own kind of exhausting. Doc Ferris said no again, quicker this time, like he'd rehearsed it in the days since my last visit, like refusing me had gotten easier with practice the way most cruelties do. But it was Ezra Pollard I found waiting outside the feed store, arms crossed, like he'd known I'd come and had been standing there specifically to enjoy it. "Heard the boy made it through," Ezra said. "Heard he rode right past 3 good men freezing to death to get to his kin. He said it like an accusation, like the boy's survival was itself an offense against the men who hadn't survived, as though grief required someone new to blame and Nashoba's living presence was the nearest available target. Man was looking for his father, I said. That's all that was. That's not all it was to the Crave family, Ezra said. That's not all it's going to be to this town. I didn't have an answer for him that day. I rode home with nothing again, no doctor, no bandages beyond what I already had, no help of any kind, and somewhere in that ride, cold settling into my bones in a way that had nothing to do with the weather, I made a decision I'd been circling for 4 days without quite letting myself land on it. I was going to set that leg myself, whatever it cost, whatever I had to do. I won't dress it up as more than it was. I'd helped birth calves gone wrong, set bones on cattle that would have been shot rather than saved on most other outfits, but I was no surgeon, and Etza knew it as well as I did. What he told me, the night before, while Nashoba slept sitting upright against the wall for the first time in 3 days, has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that whole hard winter. You are afraid you will do this wrong, Etza said. It wasn't a question. I am, I admitted. Good, he said. A man who is not afraid of a thing like this should not be trusted to do it. Then, after a pause long enough that I thought the fever had pulled him back under, my son has already ridden through the worst thing either of us will face this winter. Whatever you do to my leg tomorrow, it will not be worse than that ride. Do not carry more fear into this room than the room can hold. I did it the next morning, with Nashoba holding his father's shoulders down and refusing, absolutely refusing, to let his damaged hands shake even once during the whole terrible hour it took. I won't describe the particulars of it here. Some things belong to the men who lived them, not to the page. I'll tell you only that it was done, that Etza did not lose the leg though it never again bent the way it once had, and that somewhere in the middle of that hour, gripping his father's shoulders with 2 hands that had cost him 2 fingers to get there, Nashoba was crying without a single sound, tears freezing half-formed on a face that had ridden through a blizzard, without once giving the storm the satisfaction of seeing him break. That was the moment I understood something about strength I hadn't understood before that winter, something I've turned over in my mind for 40 years since. Strength isn't the absence of breaking. It's what a man does with himself in the hour after he's already broken, when the thing that needed doing still needs doing regardless. They stayed with me through the worst of that winter, 6 weeks, in the end, before Etza could ride, and Nashoba never once left his father's side except to tend the animals or split wood, work he took to with a fierce, silent gratitude that told me more about the life he'd come from than any story he could have told me outright. Ash Hollow never fully forgave me for it. Ezra Pollard stopped speaking to me altogether, and 2 of my regular buyers found other ranches to do business with that spring, which cost me more than I ever let on to anyone, including myself, until years later when I finally added it up in my ledger and saw the true price of that winter written out in a column I'd never planned to fill. I don't regret a line of it. The morning they finally rode out, Etza favoring that leg but upright, whole, alive, Nashoba stopped at my gate and turned back before I'd even finished saying my goodbyes. He didn't say much. He was never a man given to long speeches, that boy, even after everything. He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out the compass, the one his father had traded 3 pelts for years before, the one that had carried him through 11 hours of a storm that killed better men, and he held it out to me. I don't need it anymore, he said. I know the way home now, all of it. I told him I couldn't take a thing like that from him. He shook his head, that same small, patient correction he'd given me every time I mispronounced his name that whole long winter, and pressed it into my hand anyway. Then keep it as a debt paid, he said. You said once you keep a ledger, put this where it balances. I have it still. It sits on the shelf above my writing desk, where I've kept my ledger for 40 years. And some nights, when the wind picks up in a particular way that reminds me of that storm. I take it down and hold it and think about a boy who rode through the one thing in this world he had every reason to fear most, because the alternative, losing his father to the same silence that had already taken his mother, was a thing he'd already decided, long before that night, he would never let happen twice. I never saw them again after that spring, not properly. I heard word, now and then, over the years, carried through the kind of loose network that exists between ranches and trading posts and men who move between worlds that don't much like each other. I heard Etza lived another 11 years after that winter, walked with a permanent limp but walked all the same. I heard Nashoba had children of his own eventually, and that he told them when they were old enough about a blizzard and a compass and a debt paid to a rancher who kept a ledger. I like to think, on the nights I take that compass down, that somewhere in whatever ledger Nashoba kept in his own memory, my name landed in the right column. I never did find out for certain. Some debts, I've come to understand, you pay without ever knowing if the account was settled the way you meant it. I still keep my ledger. Most of the columns in it these days are full of the ordinary debts of an old man's ordinary life: feed bills, favors, small kindnesses traded back and forth with neighbors who have long since forgotten they were ever anything but neighborly. But there's one page near the back that I've never crossed out and never added to. Just one line, written the night after they rode away, in handwriting shakier than I remember my hand being back then. Some debts aren't meant to be paid, only carried and honored for as long as you're able to carry them. I still don't know, all these years later, whether that's a wisdom or a wound. Some nights I think it's both, and some nights I think that's the only kind of truth that's ever worth keeping.